Hello friends, this is Vaibhav Purandare here. My new video is about Arthur Conan Doyle. Yes, the creator of Sherlock Holmes. We've all heard about Conan Doyle and we've all read his stories. This story is about a real crime case that Conan Doyle solved, just like his fictional character Sherlock Holmes. In the early years of the 20th century, one day Arthur Conan Doyle received a letter. It was from a man called George Edalji. Edalji sounds Parsi, doesn't it? George Edalji's father was a Parsi gentleman. He had come to England in the 19th century and he had married a local English woman. He also got converted to Christianity and he became the vicar in a place called Great Worley, a place that's in Staffordshire. To this man was born George Edalji. When George was 16 years old, the Edalji family began receiving some threatening letters. There wasn't much love lost between the Edalji family and other members of the community in Staffordshire. That was because there was an element of racism involved, and many people saw the vicar with his Parsi origins and his family as outsiders and as non-natives. So they began to receive some threatening letters. At the same time, other members of the clergy in Staffordshire started receiving letters in the name of the Edaljis. Somebody had forged the signatures of Edalji and sent letters to members of the clergy. Now that added to the bad blood between the family and members of the local community. Suspicion fell on the 16-year-old boy George. Though he was never held guilty, never indicted for the crimes, the local community and the cops also believed that George was responsible. Anyway, all of that passed and George studied to be a lawyer. He qualified as a lawyer and in time he became a successful solicitor until a really big thing happened. In the year 1903, there was a series of killings of animals in Great Worley and around that place in Staffordshire. The animals were killed and they were mutilated. There was already plenty of resentment against George Edalji, and now that he'd become a successful solicitor, that resentment had increased. And the police, on the basis of some statements made by members of the local community, began to suspect George Edalji. Remember, there was also the previous case of the letters because of which George had been suspected. On what basis, nobody knew, but he was suspected at that time. When the killings happened, he became a suspect. And the chief constable of the area decided that he would post 6 cops outside the Edalji's house to keep a watch on the house and specifically to keep a watch on George's movements. Then one night, George returned home and the 6 cops were keeping a watch outside his house. That same night, a pony, a small horse, was found dead in the area around the place. The next morning, when George went to his office, which was in Birmingham, the cops entered his house, seized some of his belongings, and on the basis of what they saw and said they had found in those belongings, they arrested him for the killing and mutilation of many animals in the area. He protested his innocence. He said he had nothing to do with the killings, but the cops said they had evidence. The trial soon began. What was the evidence that the cops placed before the court, before the local sessions court? There were a few things. First was a pair of muddy shoes that the cops had recovered from his house. A pair of trousers which were dirty and which had some soil on them. The third, the police said, was some horse hair and some drops of blood which they had found on George's clothes which they had confiscated from the house. Now the blood and the horsehair looked like it was serious evidence, and George Edalji was convicted and sentenced to 7 years in jail. He again protested his innocence. 10,000 people from outside Staffordshire wrote to the court and to the police saying that George was not the killer, could not be the killer, and he looked innocent. But the court and the cops went by the so-called evidence they had marshaled, and he was sent to 7 years in jail. After 3 years, he was suddenly released from jail without any expression of regret from the local police or from the other authorities. But he was told that he could not resume his legal career. So his career as a solicitor was seriously damaged. He had earned no money at all, and now he was out of jail, but he could not practice as a lawyer. George Adalji wrote a letter to Arthur Conan Doyle, the writer of the famous Sherlock Holmes stories, asking him to look into his case and appealing to him to investigate this matter because he was an expert. And Conan Doyle saw some initial merit in his arguments and he began investigating the case. He was a writer of fiction, he was not a sleuth at all. But he started investigating on the basis of Adalji's letter. And what did he find? We've already seen the pieces of evidence that the cops had gathered on the basis of which George Adalji had been convicted. Let's take the pair of muddy shoes. Now anybody could have a pair of muddy shoes because those fields were muddy, the fields in which the local population moved. That was no evidence at all. The second evidence was there was a razor blade which the cops had presented in court and said the pony that was found dead that night had been killed by George with that blade. Conan Doyle got that blade examined and there was absolutely no trace, zero traces of blood on that particular blade. Second, the pair of trousers. Conan Doyle got the soil examined. It turned out that the soil on his trousers and the soil at the scene of the crime were totally different. The third evidence was the clothes which had blood. This was the most shocking part of the investigation. What Conan Doyle discovered was that the policemen had actually wrapped a part of the dead horse's hide in George Adalji's clothes, which is how the horse hair and those traces of blood appeared on his clothes, which were apparently confiscated. This was absolutely shocking, and Conan Doyle said it was shocking. Conan Doyle was convinced of George Adalji's innocence and he called him for a meeting. This meeting itself turned out to be very interesting. Arthur Conan Doyle arrived late for the meeting and he saw George Adalji was busy reading a newspaper. The newspaper was in his hand, and the moment Conan Doyle looked at him, he was now even 200% convinced of his innocence. Why was that so? Because he realized that George Adalji had myopia and he had something called as astigmatism. Astigmatism is a fault in the eyes which means that a person cannot see things properly and focus on an object properly. So his myopia and his astigmatism convinced Conan Doyle even more that there was no way this man could have gone out into the fields late at night in the dark and set about killing animals, and mutilating them. He wrote an article, Conan Doyle wrote an article in the Daily Telegraph talking about his findings, his investigation. And on the basis of his findings, which were published later by all newspapers, the case was reopened and a 3-member probe commission was set up. The 3-member probe commission said that the cops had not actually tried to investigate the case, but the cops had tried to find evidence against George Adalji. And the cops were predisposed against this man of Parsi origin. And they said that he needed to be pardoned. So the commission pardoned him. At the same time, the commission also made a statement saying George Adalji in a way had brought this upon himself. How had he brought it upon himself? Because the commission felt that the nasty letters that George's father had received when George was 16 years old had been written by George himself. So then he had invited this and sort of asked for this. That was a very odd statement to make, but on balance, at least the panel said that he ought to be pardoned, and he was pardoned on that basis. Conan Doyle concluded that his conviction was a result of outright racism. He accused the English authorities of outright racism. Okay, that matter was sorted. But somebody had killed the animals. Now Conan Doyle said, who has killed them? Who is the real killer? Just when he was thinking about this question, Conan Doyle started receiving threatening letters himself. Somebody wrote to him a letter saying, when all these ghoulish murders have happened, why should you be spared? And he started examining the handwriting. Just when he was examining the handwriting and comparing it with the handwriting in the other letters, the signatures on the other letters, he received another threatening letter. Now this letter was extremely interesting because in that letter, some very nasty remarks had been made about a former headmaster of a grammar school in Staffordshire. It was the Walsall Grammar School, that was the name of the school in Staffordshire. And this letter made nasty remarks about the former headmaster of that school. Conan Doyle got very curious and got in touch with that former headmaster of the grammar school and asked him if there might be a student or somebody who had held some sort of resentment against him. The former headmaster told him that yes, there was a student whom he had expelled from school because the boy had completely destructive behavior. So he had thrown him out of school and he might have some resentment. Conan Doyle now got more curious and he went looking for that boy. That boy had grown up into a big man and he was actually now a butcher. And one of his friends, in fact, testified later that he had seen that butcher with his lancet in the area in which the animals were found dead on one of those nights. Now, what does the Home Office do? In spite of Conan Doyle's findings, it does not reopen the case to find out who the real killer is. Conan Doyle says, okay, if you're not reopening the investigation and if you don't want to find out who the real killer is, at least compensate George Edalji for the losses he has suffered, for the loss of income he has suffered. Please do that because his arrest was wrongful and now it's established that he was innocent. The Home Department said, no, we cannot compensate him. We've pardoned him. At that point, Conan Doyle concluded that it was too much of him to expect any sort of justice, reason and fairness from the bureaucracy, because he said the bureaucracy will always protect its own officials, which is the cops and the other officials belonging to the Home Department itself. Conan Doyle interestingly came up with two conclusions. One, racism against the Parsi man, and second, of an institutional failure by the Home Department and its attempt to protect its own kind and not really look for justice. But it's a fascinating case, a case that Conan Doyle well and truly cracked. In fact, he even found what we may really call the genuine killer, just that the authorities did not take the case forward. Thank you. If you liked my video and if you still haven't subscribed to my channel, please do, and press the bell button so that you get notifications every time I put out a new video up here. Thank you so much and see you soon.